The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Frank Morrison's knuckles went white as he gripped the edge of the front desk, the metal biting into his palms. 6 years. 6 goddamn years since Detroit, and now it all came crashing down in his own gym because Muhammad Ali, the most famous man in the world, decided to waltz in and detonate his life. Tommy's thick fingers hesitated at his jacket. The enforcer's small eyes darted between Ali and Frank, processing. Tommy might have been muscle, but he wasn't stupid. He could smell opportunity like blood in the water. Detroit? Tommy's voice carried the weight of gravel. What happened in Detroit, Frank? Frank's mouth felt full of cotton. Around them, the usual afternoon crowd, construction workers, off-duty cops, a few college boys trying to bulk up, had gone statue still. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of someone's jump rope in the back corner, the guy oblivious to the drama unfolding near the heavy bags. Ali stepped forward, his movements fluid despite being cornered moments before. Tell him, Frank. Tell Tommy about Officer Jerome Washington. Tell him about the heroin you planted in that man's car. The words hit Frank like a sledgehammer to the chest. His vision tunneled. Officer Jerome Washington, the first black cop hired by Detroit PD's 14th Precinct, honest as the day was long. Too honest for Frank's partner, Detective Ray Kowalski, who'd been skimming from drug busts for 2 years. I don't know what you're talking about, Frank managed, but his voice cracked like an old recording. Ali's smile never wavered. Jerome had a wife, Sarah. 3 kids, Marcus, little Denise, and baby James. You remember baby James, don't you, Frank? How he cried when they dragged his daddy away in handcuffs. Tommy's head swiveled toward Frank like a tank turret finding its target. The Chicago outfit valued leverage above everything, and whatever Ali was serving up smelled like pure gold. Frank's legs felt unsteady. He'd left Detroit for Birmingham precisely to escape this moment, trading his captain's badge for barbells and squat racks. 6 years of telling himself he'd had no choice, that Kowalski would have buried them both if Frank had talked. 6 years of building Morrison's gym into something respectable, something clean. The planted evidence sent Jerome to Jackson Prison for 15 years, Ali continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the gym now. Destroyed his career, his family, his life. Sarah had to move the kids into her mother's place in the projects. Lost the house, lost everything. The jump rope had stopped. Frank could feel every eye in the place burning into him. Tommy stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over the desk. This true, Frank? You dirty? It was different then, Frank whispered, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. You don't understand the pressure we were under. The quotas, the politics. So it is true. Tommy's grin revealed teeth like broken yellow tombstones. Well, well, this changes things considerable. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd survived 2 tours in Korea, 16 years walking the worst beats in Detroit, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The careful life he'd built in Birmingham, the gym, his reputation as a stand-up guy, his quiet retirement, crumbling like a house of cards. Here's what's going to happen, Tommy said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You and me and pretty boy here are going to step into your office for a private conversation, and depending on how cooperative you are about this Detroit situation, maybe Ali's debt gets restructured. Ali's eyes never left Frank's face. Or maybe we discuss how a certain ex-captain might want to finally tell the truth about what happened to Officer Washington. Frank felt the walls closing in. The afternoon sun streaming through the gym's grimy windows suddenly felt oppressive, the familiar smell of sweat and chalk suffocating. Behind Tommy he could see some of his regulars edging toward the exit, smart enough to recognize when recreational weightlifting had transformed into something far more dangerous. His hand moved instinctively toward the .38 he kept in the desk drawer. Old habits. But what was he going to do? Shoot Muhammad Ali? Gun down the heavyweight champion of the world in his own gym? Tommy caught the movement. Easy there, Captain. No need for things to get messy. Yet. Frank's mind raced. How did Ali even know about Detroit? About Jerome Washington? The cover-up had been airtight. Just Frank, Kowalski, and their sergeant, Bill Murphy. Murphy died of a heart attack 3 years ago. Kowalski was probably still working Detroit, still dirty, still untouchable. Unless Frank's blood turned to ice water as the pieces clicked together. Unless Jerome Washington had gotten out early. Unless 15 years had become 6 on good behavior. Unless someone had been very, very patient about settling scores. Ali stepped closer to the desk, close enough that Frank could smell his cologne, see the absolute certainty in his dark eyes. Your office, Frank. Now. Time to discuss the past. Frank's office door clicked shut behind them with the finality of a coffin lid. The small space, barely 10 by 12 feet, suddenly felt microscopic, with Tommy's bulk taking up half the available air. Frank moved behind his desk like a condemned man approaching the gallows, his legs unsteady beneath him. The office walls told the story of a life carefully reconstructed. His police commendations hung in cheap frames beside photos of gym members hitting personal records. A faded American flag from his Korean War service draped one corner. On the desk sat a single-framed photograph that made Frank's chest tighten. A picture of him and his daughter Katie from her high school graduation, both of them squinting into Alabama sunshine, her arm looped through his with genuine affection. Katie, 24 now, teaching second grade at Jefferson Elementary just 6 blocks away. She stopped by every Tuesday after school, always bringing him coffee and whatever gossip the other teachers were sharing. She'd inherited her mother's laugh. The one thing Frank had left of Margaret before the cancer took her 3 years ago. Katie had no idea about Detroit, about Jerome Washington, about any of it. To her, Frank Morrison was just a retired cop who'd moved south for the weather and opened a gym because he believed in helping people get stronger. "Nice setup you got here," Tommy said, his voice dripping with mock appreciation as he examined the commendations. "Look at this, Medal of Valor, 1963. For extraordinary courage in the line of duty, real hero material." The irony tasted like copper pennies in Frank's mouth. The Medal of Valor had been for pulling 2 kids from a burning tenement, 6 months before he'd helped destroy Jerome Washington's family, before he'd learned that courage was a luxury honest cops couldn't always afford. Ali remained standing near the door, his presence filling the room like electricity before a storm. Up close, Frank could see the toll the last few years had taken, the slight puffiness around his eyes, the way he held his left shoulder just a fraction higher than his right. The government had tried to break this man, and in many ways they'd succeeded. But Ali's eyes still burned with that same fierce intelligence that had made him dangerous long before he learned to fight. "Tell me about your daughter," Ali said quietly. Frank's blood turned to slush. "Leave her out of this. Pretty girl. Katie, right? I saw her picture in the Birmingham News last month. Local teacher wins Innovation Award. You must be proud." The photograph Ali mentioned sat in Frank's desk drawer, clipped from the newspaper, and read so many times the edges had gone soft. Katie standing in her classroom, surrounded by smiling 7-year-olds, holding a plaque for her work with underprivileged students. She'd called him that night, breathless with excitement, and Frank had listened to her talk for 40 minutes about reading programs and art supplies, his heart swelling with a pride so pure it physically hurt. "She doesn't know," Frank whispered, "about any of it." "Course not." Tommy eased his bulk into the chair across from Frank's desk, the cheap metal frame groaning in protest. "Nice daughters got a way of complicating things, don't they? Makes a man think twice before making stupid decisions." The threat landed like a physical blow. Frank's vision blurred at the edges, and for a moment he was back in Detroit, standing in that precinct locker room while Kowalski explained how easy it would be to plant evidence on an honest cop who asked too many questions, how quickly careers could disappear, how accidents happened to people who didn't understand the way things worked. Frank's hands trembled as he opened the desk drawer, not for the gun this time, but for the small bottle of heart medication Dr. Parsons had prescribed after his last physical. The stress of running the gym, the doctor had said, the normal wear and tear of a man pushing 60 who'd lived a hard life. If only the good doctor knew. "Jerome Washington got out last year," Ali said, his voice cutting through Frank's racing thoughts. "Served 6 years of a 15-year sentence. Good behavior, overcrowding, progressive parole board. Funny thing about prison, gives a man lots of time to think, lots of time to plan." The pill dissolved bitter under Frank's tongue. Outside the office, Frank could hear the normal sounds of his gym, weights clanking, men grunting with effort, the occasional burst of laughter, his world, his carefully constructed sanctuary. All of it about to collapse because of something he'd done when Nixon was still vice president and the world seemed like a simpler place. "What do you want?" Frank asked. Allie and Tommy exchanged a look that made Frank's stomach clench. "Justice," Allie said simply. "The truth. And maybe," he glanced at Katie's graduation photo, "a chance for you to finally do the right thing before it's too late to matter." The late afternoon sun slanted through the office's single window, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward Frank like accusing fingers. Frank stared at the shadows crawling across his desk, his mind reeling. The silence stretched until Tommy's chair creaked as he shifted forward, breaking the spell. "Justice is expensive," Tommy said, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "Truth even more so. But you know what's really costly, Frank? Keeping secrets when the wrong people find out about them." Ali moved away from the door, his hands clasped behind his back like a general surveying a battlefield. "Jerome's been busy since he got out, Frank. Real busy. Turns out 6 years in Jackson prison teaches a man about patience, about planning, about making the right connections." Frank's throat constricted. "What kind of connections?" Instead of answering, Ali reached into his jacket pocket. Frank's hand twitched toward the desk drawer, but Ali's movement was slow, deliberate. He withdrew a manila envelope, worn at the edges, and placed it gently on the desk between them. "Open it," Ali said. Frank's hands shook as he picked up the envelope. The paper was warm, as if it had been carried close to someone's body for a long time. Inside were photographs, black and white, grainy, but clear enough to make Frank's world tilt sideways. The first photo showed him standing outside the Detroit Police 14th Precinct, 1965, his hair thicker then, his face younger but harder. The second showed him in conversation with Detective Ray Kowalski beside a squad car. Nothing incriminating about that. Partners talked all the time. But the third photograph stopped Frank's heart. It was him and Kowalski at 2:47 a.m. on October 15th, 1965. He could see the timestamp in the corner. Standing beside Jerome Washington's 1962 Buick Skylark in the parking lot behind Mallory's bar. Frank was handing something to Kowalski. Something small, wrapped in plastic. The heroin that would destroy Jerome Washington's life. How? The word came out as barely a whisper. "Jerome wasn't the only honest cop in that precinct," Ali said. "Officer Dennis Hayworth, remember him? Young guy, fresh out of the academy, worked the night shift. Had himself a little hobby, photography. Liked to document police work, he said. For posterity." Frank remembered Hayworth. Eager kid with thick glasses and an annoying habit of asking questions. He'd transferred to another precinct a few months after the Washington incident. Frank had assumed he'd washed out, couldn't handle real police work. "Hayworth kept a lot of interesting photos," Ali continued. "Never knew what to do with them until Jerome got out. Funny how guilt eats at a man. Hayworth's been carrying these pictures for 6 years, Frank, waiting for the right moment to do something about what he saw." Tommy leaned forward, his small eyes gleaming. "Here's where it gets real interesting. See, Jerome Washington's got himself some new friends, brothers who understand the value of patience, who know how to turn information into power." The room seemed to spin around Frank. The Black Panthers, it had to be. Jerome had connected with the Panthers, probably in prison. They'd know exactly how to use photographs like these, not just to destroy Frank, but to expose the entire rotten system that had protected cops like Kowalski for decades. "There are copies," Ali said, as if reading Frank's thoughts. "Lots of copies, in lots of different places. Safety deposit boxes, lawyers' offices, newspaper morgues. Jerome learned about insurance the hard way." Frank's chest felt tight despite the heart medication. Katie's face smiled at him from the graduation photo, innocent and trusting. She taught kids who looked just like Jerome Washington's children, black kids from broken homes, kids whose fathers had disappeared into the system, kids who deserved better than the world Frank had helped create. "What do you want?" Frank asked again, but this time the words carried the weight of surrender. Tommy's grin widened. "See, that's where things get complicated. Because this ain't just about Ali's debt anymore. This is about opportunity. The kind of opportunity that comes along maybe once in a lifetime." Ali picked up Katie's photograph, studying it with unnerving intensity. "Pretty girl. Good girl, from what I hear. the kind of person who believes in doing right, who trusts that her father raised her with proper values. Don't, Frank whispered. Oh, I'm not threatening her, Allie said, setting the photo down with careful precision. I'm just wondering what she'd think if she knew her daddy helped send an innocent man to prison, if she knew the reason Jerome Washington's children grew up without a father. The weight of 6 years of buried guilt crashed down on Frank like a collapsed building. Every morning he'd woken up in this gym. Every time Katie had looked at him with love and respect, every moment he'd tried to convince himself that the past was past, all of it had been leading to this reckoning. Outside the office, the gym had gone quiet. Too quiet. Tommy stood up, his bulk blocking most of the light from the window. Time to make some choices, Frank. Hard choices. The kind that define what a man really is when the chips are down. Frank closed his eyes, but the photographs were burned into his retinas. The past had finally caught up with him, and there was no going back. Frank's eyes snapped open to find both men watching him with predatory patience. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, drowning out the muffled sounds from the gym beyond his office door. I need time, Frank said, his voice cracking like old leather. To think, to figure this out. Tommy's laugh was a sound like breaking glass. Time's a luxury, Frank, and luxuries cost extra. Frank pushed back from his desk, chair wheels squeaking against the worn linoleum. He moved to the window, desperate for air that didn't taste of his own fear. Through the grimy glass he could see Birmingham stretching out in the late afternoon heat. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that 6 blocks away a man's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. This is insane, Frank muttered, more to himself than to them. You can't just waltz in here and... Can't what? Allie's voice carried that dangerous quiet again. Can't demand justice for an innocent man? Can't ask questions about dirty cops who never paid for their crimes? Frank spun around. You don't understand the situation we were in. Kowalski wasn't just my partner. He had connections. Real connections. The kind that could make people disappear. Like Jerome Washington disappeared? Ali stepped closer. Like his family disappeared into poverty while you got promoted to captain? The accusation hit Frank like a physical blow. He'd made captain 8 months after the Washington frame-up, a promotion that came with Kowalski's enthusiastic recommendation and the grateful silence of superiors who appreciated officers who didn't rock boats or ask inconvenient questions about evidence lockers. I tried to transfer, Frank said weakly, requested a different partner 3 times. But you didn't, Tommy observed, settling back into his protesting chair. You stayed. You played along. You kept your mouth shut like a good little soldier. Frank's hands clenched into fists. For a moment, the old police training kicked in, the instinct to respond to threats with force, to establish dominance through violence. But those days were long gone, buried under 6 years of barbells and small-town respectability. A soft knock on the office door froze all 3 men. Frank's blood turned to ice water as a familiar voice called out, "Daddy, you in there? I brought you some of Mrs. Henderson's peach pie. Katie." Frank's vision tunneled. Tuesday. It was Tuesday, which meant Katie always stopped by after school. In all the chaos of Ali's arrival and Tommy's threats, he'd completely forgotten. "Just a minute, sweetheart," Frank called out, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. He looked desperately at Ali and Tommy. Please, not in front of her. Ali's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps recognition of a father's protective instinct. Tommy, however, smiled like a shark scenting blood. "Frank?" Katie's voice carried a note of concern. "Is everything okay? Your truck's out front, but the gym seems awfully quiet." Through the thin office door, Frank could hear Katie moving around the main gym area. She knew this place as well as he did, had helped him paint the walls when he first opened, had celebrated with him when the business finally turned profitable. To her, Morrison's gym was proof of her father's integrity, evidence that a man could start over and build something honest and good. "She's gonna come looking," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible but somehow more threatening than his earlier shouting. Pretty little thing like that, all curious and concerned about her daddy. Frank felt something break inside his chest. "What do you want from me?" Ali moved to the desk, his fingers drumming silently against the wood surface. Jerome Washington wants his life back, Frank, his reputation, his family's honor, things that can't be bought or bargained for. The man's dead, Frank said desperately. Jerome Washington, the cop he was. That man died 6 years ago in a prison cell. You can't resurrect the dead. No, Allie agreed quietly. But you can tell the truth about how they died. Another knock, more insistent now. Daddy, I'm coming in. You're starting to worry me. The door handle turned. Frank's heart stopped completely as Katie's familiar silhouette appeared in the doorway, backlit by the gym's fluorescent lighting. She was still wearing her teaching clothes, a simple blue dress with chalk dust on the sleeves, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her eyes moved from Frank to Allie to Tommy, and Frank watched her teacher's instincts kick in, that same careful assessment she probably used when walking into a classroom full of potentially disruptive second graders. "Oh," she said, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness. "I didn't realize you had clients. I can come back later." But her eyes had already registered the tension in the room, the photographs scattered on the desk, the way all three men stood frozen like deer in headlights. Frank watched understanding dawn on her face, not specific knowledge, but the terrible certainty that whatever was happening in this office was far more serious than personal training consultations. "Katie," Frank began, but the words died in his throat. The past had finally found him, and now it was reaching for his daughter, too. Katie's smile faltered as the silence stretched too long. Frank watched his daughter's gaze sweep the room again, this time with the sharper focus of someone sensing real danger. Her eyes lingered on the scattered photographs, on Tommy's massive frame squeezed into the protesting chair, on the way Ali stood perfectly still with his hands clasped behind his back, like a man accustomed to being watched. "I'm sorry," she said, taking a half step backward. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I'll just—" "Stay," Ali said quietly, and something in his tone made Katie freeze mid-retreat. Not threatening exactly, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "Your father and I were just discussing some old business. From Detroit." Frank felt the blood drain from his face. Katie's eyes snapped to him, suddenly sharp with questions she'd never thought to ask before. She'd grown up hearing stories about her father's police career, carefully edited versions that painted him as one of the good guys who'd left the force because he was tired of fighting a losing battle against crime and corruption. She'd never questioned why he'd moved them so far south, why he'd never kept in touch with his old partners, why certain subjects made him go quiet and distant. "Detroit?" Katie's voice was careful, controlled. "Daddy, you said you barely knew anyone there worth staying in touch with." Tommy's chuckle was like stones grinding together. "Your daddy knew lots of people in Detroit. Real interesting people. Isn't that right, Captain Morrison?" The rank hit Katie like a physical blow. Frank watched her face change as pieces clicked into place, fragments of overheard phone calls, the way he sometimes jolted awake from nightmares he never discussed, the careful way he'd always deflected questions about why he'd really left police work behind. "Captain?" Katie looked at Frank with something approaching betrayal. "You were a captain? You told me you never made it past detective." Frank's chest constricted. Another lie exposed, another crack in the foundation he'd built their life on. "Katie, sweetheart, I can explain." "Can you?" Ali moved closer to the desk, his presence seeming to fill the cramped office. "Can you explain to your daughter how a man becomes a captain, Katie? Tell her about the promotions that come to officers who know how to keep their mouths shut when they see things they shouldn't see." Katie's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. Frank recognized the tone, the same calm authority she used with disruptive students, the inherited strength that had carried her through her mother's death and her father's increasingly distant moods. "I think I should call someone. The police, maybe." "And tell them what?" Tommy asked, genuinely curious. "That your daddy's having a conversation with Muhammad Ali? That's what you're looking at, sweetheart. The heavyweight champion of the world, right here in your daddy's gym." For the first time since entering the room, Katie really looked at Ali, not just the dangerous stranger in her father's office, but the face that had been on magazine covers and television screens for over a decade. Recognition dawned slowly, followed immediately by deeper confusion. "Mr. Ali?" she whispered. Then, stronger, what are you doing here? Ali's expression softened slightly as he studied her face. I'm here because your father helped destroy an innocent man's life, Katie. A good man, a police officer with children about your age who trusted the system to protect him when he tried to do the right thing. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Frank watched his daughter processing this information, saw the exact moment when her faith in him began to crack. Katie had built her entire adult identity around the values she believed her father had taught her: honesty, integrity, standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. Her classroom walls were covered with pictures of civil rights heroes. Her lesson plans included units on justice and fairness, and the importance of speaking truth to power. Daddy? Katie's voice was small now, uncertain. What is he talking about? Frank opened his mouth, but no words came. How could he explain Ray Kowalski's threats? How could he make her understand the impossible choice between his own survival and Jerome Washington's freedom? How could he tell her that the man she'd looked up to her entire life was a coward who'd chosen safety over justice when it mattered most? Show her, Ali said softly, gesturing toward the photographs scattered across Frank's desk. Show her what Captain Frank Morrison did in Detroit in 1965. Tommy's grin widened as he watched the family drama unfold. This is getting real interesting. Nothing like a father-daughter reunion to clarify a man's priorities. Katie took a step toward the desk, her teacher's curiosity overriding her growing fear. Frank's hand shot out to cover the photographs, but he was too slow. Katie's eyes locked onto the top image, the timestamp, the police uniforms, the small plastic package changing hands in a parking lot lit by streetlights. Oh, God, she breathed. Daddy, what did you do? Frank's hand trembled as he slowly pulled it back from the photographs, watching his daughter's world collapse in real time. Katie's eyes moved across the images with the methodical precision of someone trying to solve a puzzle, her teacher's instincts kicking in even as her heart broke. That's not, Frank started, then stopped. The lie died in his throat as Katie picked up the clearest photograph, the one that showed his face in perfect detail as he handed the planted evidence to Kowalski. You were dirty, Katie whispered, and the word dirty came out like something poisonous. All those stories about leaving the force because you couldn't stand the corruption, about wanting to build something honest. I wasn't dirty. The words exploded out of Frank with desperate force. Not like that. I never took money, never. You framed someone. Katie's voice was steadier now, colder. She set the photograph down with surgical precision. An innocent man. Ali stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. Jerome Washington, 28 years old, father of 2 girls ages 6 and 8. He'd been investigating missing evidence from drug busts, asking questions about why certain arrests never led to convictions, getting too close to the truth about officers like Detective Ray Kowalski. Frank watched his daughter's face transform as the full scope of his betrayal sank in. This wasn't just about bent cops or institutional corruption. This was personal. Katie taught children who looked like Jerome Washington's daughters. She dedicated her life to fighting the kind of systemic injustice her own father had participated in. How long? Katie asked, her voice barely audible. 6 years, Frank admitted. I've been carrying this for 6 years. 6 years of lies. Katie's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. 6 years of letting me believe. God, Daddy, do you have any idea who I am, what I stand for, what you taught me to stand for? Tommy leaned forward, savoring the family destruction. This is beautiful, really touching, but maybe we should focus on more pressing concerns. He gestured toward Ali. The champ here didn't come all the way to Alabama for a therapy session. But Ali held up a hand, his attention fixed entirely on Katie. Tell me about your father, Miss Morrison. The man you thought you knew. Katie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but her voice remained strong. He taught me that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, that good people have an obligation to speak up when they see wrong being done. She turned to Frank with something approaching hatred. He taught me that a person's character is defined by what they do when they think no one is watching. The irony hit Frank like a physical blow. Every value he'd tried to instill in Katie, every lesson about integrity and courage, had been a form of penance, his attempt to raise her as the person he'd failed to be. But instead of redemption, he'd created his own judge and jury. Jerome Washington believed those same things, Allie said quietly, right up until your father helped destroy his life to protect a corrupt partner. Frank found his voice, desperate now. You don't understand the situation I was in. Kowalski had connections, real power. He could have what? Katie spun on him, her teacher's authority blazing. Hurt you? So you decided to hurt someone else instead? An innocent man? Yes, the admission tore out of Frank's throat. Yes, I was scared. I was weak. I chose my own safety over Jerome Washington's life, and I've regretted it every single day since. The silence that followed was deafening. Frank could hear his own ragged breathing, the distant hum of the gym's air conditioning, the sound of his carefully constructed world finally, completely collapsing. Tommy broke the silence with a slow clap. Well, that's progress. Nothing like a full confession to move things along. But Katie wasn't finished. She picked up another photograph, studying it with the same intensity she brought to grading papers. This man, Jerome Washington, where is he now? Ali's expression darkened. Dead, killed in prison 2 years ago. Someone decided he was asking too many questions about police corruption, even behind bars. The photograph slipped from Katie's fingers, fluttering to the floor. Frank watched his daughter's face cycle through shock, grief, and finally, a cold fury he'd never seen before. You killed him, she said, her voice deadly quiet. Maybe you didn't hold the knife, but you killed him just as surely as if you had. Frank opened his mouth to protest, but Katie's next words stopped him cold. And I've been carrying your name my whole life, teaching children about justice and fairness with the name of a man who sold out everything decent for his own cowardice. In that moment, Frank realized the terrible truth. He hadn't just betrayed Jerome Washington 6 years ago. He'd been betraying his own daughter every day since, allowing her to love and respect a man who didn't exist. The reckoning had begun, and there was no going back. Frank watched his daughter back away from him, each step driving another nail into the coffin of their relationship. Katie's hand found the wall behind her, steadying herself as if the very foundation of the world had shifted beneath her feet. I need to sit down, she whispered. Tommy shifted in his chair with theatrical gallantry. Take mine, sweetheart. Your old man's revelations can be a lot to process. But Katie remained standing, her back pressed against the wall, eyes never leaving Frank's face. Tell me about his family, Jerome Washington's family. Ali moved to the window, looking out at the Birmingham street beyond. 2 daughters, like I said. They were put into foster care when Jerome was convicted. The system split them up, different homes, different cities. His wife tried to hold things together, but the stigma of being married to a dirty cop destroyed her nursing career. She died 3 years later. Car accident, though some folks wondered about the circumstances. Katie's sharp intake of breath cut through the room like a blade. Frank watched her do the math. 2 little girls, orphaned by his cowardice, scattered to the winds while he'd been building his new life in Alabama. What were their names? Katie asked. And Frank recognized the teacher in her, the woman who insisted on humanizing every story, on remembering that statistics had faces and names and dreams. Denise and Sarah, Ali replied softly. 8 and 6 when it happened. They'd be 14 and 12 now, if anyone's keeping track, which most people aren't. Frank felt something crack in his chest. 14 and 12, the same ages as some of Katie's students. He tried to imagine those 2 faces among the children Katie taught every day, wondered if she saw them there, if that's why she fought so hard for the kids everyone else had given up on. Jesus Christ, Frank breathed. Oh, Jesus Christ. Yeah, Tommy said, examining his fingernails with apparent fascination. That's the thing about consequences. They got a way of spreading out, touching people you never even met, like ripples in a pond, except the pond's full of blood. Katie pushed off from the wall, moving to Frank's desk with sudden purpose. She began gathering the scattered photographs, organizing them with the same methodical care she brought to lesson planning. How many people knew about the frame-up? Enough, Ali said. Enough to keep it buried. Enough to make sure Jerome Washington died in prison with his reputation intact, meaning destroyed beyond repair. Frank watched his daughter study each image, her face growing harder with every revelation. This wasn't just about his betrayal anymore. This was about a system that had protected that betrayal, had rewarded it, had allowed it to fester in silence while good people suffered. And you knew, Katie said to Ali, not looking up from the photographs. You've known about this for how long? 2 years. Since Jerome was killed. Some mutual friends thought I might be interested in the case, given my public positions on certain subjects. Frank felt the walls closing in. Why now? Why come here? Jerome Washington is dead. His daughters are, God knows where they are. What's the point of all this? Ali turned from the window, and for the first time since entering the gym, Frank saw real anger in the champion's eyes. The point, Captain Morrison, is that silence is what killed Jerome Washington. Not the knife that found him in prison, not even the frame-up that put him there. The silence of good people who knew better and did nothing. Like me, Frank whispered. Like you, Katie confirmed, her voice hollow. Like you've been doing for 6 years while I built my whole life around believing you were something you're not. Tommy stretched in his chair, joints popping audibly. This is all very touching, really. Family therapy at its finest. But I got business to conclude here, and the meter's running on my patience. Frank had almost forgotten about Tommy's original purpose. Ali's gambling debts, the Chicago outfit's demands. The mob enforcer had been content to watch the personal drama unfold, but now Frank could see calculation returning to those cold eyes. Here's what's going to happen, Tommy continued, rising to his full intimidating height. The champ's going to settle his debts. With money or with pain, his choice. And Captain Morrison here is going to help facilitate that conversation, seeing as how his family's honor is now part of the equation. Frank felt the trap closing around him. Tommy wasn't just collecting debts, he was orchestrating something larger, using Frank's exposed secrets as leverage. But for what? Katie finished organizing the photographs and looked up at her father with eyes that held no warmth, no forgiveness. You have to make this right. I can't bring Jerome Washington back, Frank said desperately. No, Ali agreed quietly. But you can tell the truth, finally, completely, on the record. Frank stared at the 3 people who now controlled his fate. His daughter, whose love he'd lost, the champion, whose justice he'd denied, and the enforcer, whose purposes remained opaque but undeniably dangerous. The moment of no return had arrived, and every choice led into darkness. Frank stood frozen as the full weight of the moment crashed down upon him. 6 years of carefully constructed lies, 6 years of running from the truth, had led to this. His daughter looking at him like a stranger, Muhammad Ali demanding justice for a dead man, and Tommy the Tank Torino orchestrating some larger game Frank was only beginning to understand. On the record, Frank repeated slowly, the words tasting like ashes. You want me to confess, publicly. I want you to do what Jerome Washington would have done, Ali said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him more than just a boxer. I want you to choose courage over comfort, finally. Tommy's laugh cut through the tension like broken glass. See, this is where it gets interesting, because the champ here, he's got debts to pay, big debts, and I got orders to collect. But maybe we can work out a little arrangement. Frank felt the pieces clicking together, the larger picture Tommy had been painting from the moment he'd walked into the gym. You're not just here for gambling debts. Smart man. No wonder you made captain. Tommy moved closer to the desk, his massive frame casting shadows across the scattered photographs. My employers have certain interests in Chicago. Interests that could be severely damaged if certain Detroit police corruption cases started getting reopened. Cases involving officers who might have connections to people we prefer to keep protected. The trap revealed itself in all its ugly complexity. Tommy wasn't just collecting for Ali, he was ensuring Frank's silence would continue, using Ali's moral crusade as leverage to protect his organization's assets back in Detroit. Katie's voice cut through Frank's realization like a blade. No, She stepped between Tommy and the desk, her small frame radiating fierce determination. "I won't let you turn this into another cover-up." "Katie, don't," Frank started. "Don't what? Don't stand up for what's right? Don't do what you should have done 6 years ago?" Katie's eyes blazed with righteous fury. "You taught me that silence makes us complicit, Daddy. Well, I'm done being complicit in your cowardice." She grabbed the photographs from the desk, holding them against her chest like a shield. "These are going to the FBI, today, right now." Tommy's expression hardened, the veneer of charm evaporating. "I don't think you understand the situation, sweetheart. This ain't some classroom where you get to teach lessons about doing the right thing. This is the real world, where the wrong choice gets people hurt." But Katie had inherited more than just Frank's stubborn streak. She had her mother's fearlessness, the courage that had made Susan Morrison willing to stand up to anyone when her principles were on the line. "Then hurt me. But these photographs are leaving this room." The silence stretched taut as a wire. Frank watched his daughter, really saw her for the first time, standing defiant against forces that had intimidated him into submission for 6 years. She was everything he'd pretended to be, everything Jerome Washington had actually been. Ali moved then, positioning himself beside Katie with deliberate purpose. "The lady's right. This ends today." Tommy's hand drifted toward his jacket, and Frank saw the moment when words would no longer be enough. Violence had been lurking at the edges of this confrontation from the beginning, and now it was about to break into the open. But Frank Morrison, former Detroit police captain and current Alabama coward, finally remembered what it felt like to be a man worth his daughter's respect. "No." The word came out stronger than Frank felt, but it stopped Tommy's hand mid-motion. "Katie, give me the photographs." Confusion flickered across her face. "Daddy." "Give them to me." Frank held out his hand, his voice carrying the authority he'd once wielded as a police captain. "I'm the one who's going to turn them in. Not you, me." Tommy's eyes narrowed. "That's a real bad idea, Captain." "Probably." Frank took the photographs from his daughter's trembling hands. "But Katie's right. I've been silent long enough. Jerome Washington deserves better. His daughters deserve better." He looked directly at his daughter, seeing forgiveness flicker in her eyes for the first time since this nightmare began. "And so do you." Frank walked to his desk, pulled out a piece of paper, and began writing. His confession, full and complete. Every detail he could remember about the frame-up, about Kowalski, about the system that had protected them both. Tommy took a step forward, but Ali blocked his path. "It's over, Tank." "Not even close," Tommy snarled. But Frank could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. The enforcer had expected broken silence to be purchased, not freely given. As Frank wrote, he felt the weight of 6 years lifting from his shoulders. He was destroying himself, ending any chance of protection from Tommy's organization or mercy from the law. But for the first time since that night in Detroit, Frank Morrison was choosing honor over survival. The reckoning had finally come, and Frank was ready to meet it. When he finished writing, Frank set the pen down and looked up. The confession filled 2 pages, single-spaced, his police captain's training evident in the methodical detail. Names, dates, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, everything he could remember about the night they destroyed Jerome Washington. "It's done," he said quietly. Tommy's face had gone stone cold. "You just signed your death warrant, old man." "Maybe." Frank folded the confession carefully, his hand surprisingly steady. "But I've been dead for 6 years anyway. Just took me this long to notice." Katie moved to his side, her earlier anger softening into something Frank hardly dared recognize as pride. "What happens now?" Ali stepped forward, extending his hand toward Frank. "Now we make sure Jerome Washington's story gets told, all of it." Frank handed over the confession and the photographs, watching the last of his secrets leave his possession. The relief was overwhelming, like breathing freely for the first time in years. Tommy's laugh held no humor. "You think this changes anything? You think some old cop's guilt trip is going to bring down the whole system? They'll bury this confession deeper than they buried Washington." "Then we'll dig it up again," Katie said firmly, "and again, until somebody listens." Ali tucked the documents into his jacket with reverent care. "Jerome's daughters deserve to know their father was innocent. They deserve to know he died for asking the right questions, Frank felt tears he'd been holding back for 6 years finally break free. Will you tell them about this? About what their father was really trying to do? I'll find them, Ali promised, and I'll make sure they know Jerome Washington was a hero, not a criminal. Tommy backed toward the door, his massive frame tense with barely controlled rage. This ain't over, not by a long shot. My people don't forget and they don't forgive. Frank looked at his daughter, saw her mother's courage burning bright in her eyes, and felt something he'd thought was lost forever. Then tell your people this: Frank Morrison is done running. Whatever comes next, I'll face it standing up. After Tommy left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, the gym felt different, cleaner somehow, despite the scattered papers and overturned chairs. Frank began straightening up, his movements automatic, learned from decades of military precision. Daddy? Katie's voice was small, uncertain. What's going to happen to you? Frank considered lying, offering false reassurance the way he had for 6 years. Instead, he chose truth. Prison, probably. Tommy's people will make sure of that if the law doesn't get me first. Either way, my life as you've known it is over. Katie nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Good. The word hit Frank like a physical blow until she continued. The man who framed Jerome Washington, I never want to see him again. But my father, the one who taught me about courage and justice, the one who finally chose to do the right thing. She took his hands in hers. Him I can forgive. Ali watched the reunion with quiet satisfaction. Jerome would have liked seeing this. He believed in redemption, right up to the end. Frank looked around his gym, the weights and punching bags, the American flag hanging slightly crooked, the trophy case filled with accomplishments that suddenly felt hollow. All of it would be gone soon, sold to pay legal fees or seized by authorities. But for the first time in 6 years, that didn't terrify him. I want to go with you, Frank said to Ali. When you turn in the confession, I want to face the cameras, tell Jerome's story myself. Ali nodded approvingly. That takes courage. No, Frank corrected, looking at his daughter. Courage is what Katie showed today, what Jerome Washington showed when he asked those questions that got him killed. What I did was just finally stop being a coward. As they prepared to leave the gym, Frank took one last look around. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor where Muhammad Ali had stood demanding justice for a dead man, where his daughter had chosen principle over safety, where Frank Morrison had finally learned the difference between surviving and living. The story would make headlines: Disgraced Detroit police captain exposes corruption, boxing legend brings justice to light, innocent man posthumously vindicated. But Frank knew the real story was simpler and more personal: a father teaching his daughter that it's never too late to choose redemption over comfort, truth over silence. Walking into the Birmingham afternoon beside Ali and Katie, Frank Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced since that terrible night in Detroit 6 years ago. Peace.